Finally, tonight we toast an American, Patrick Reed, with his first ever major title at Augusta. Tweeting today, "This is a dream come true. I can't thank everyone enough, family, friends, and fans. I could not have done it without you all. This is what Team Reed is about." After a heady couple of hours of news, we leave you with that tonight. Congrats, you are a Masters champion, Mr. Reed. Martha's back tomorrow night. I'll see you tomorrow morning on America's Newsroom with Sandra, 9 a.m. Eastern Time. Do not be late. Enjoy the evening, everybody. Tucker is up next from Washington. Here's Tucker.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Leaders on both sides of the aisle in Congress, in the media, in our intelligence services, in virtually every overfunded think tank in Washington, have suddenly aligned tonight on a single point of agreement. America must go to war in Syria immediately. Bashar al-Assad cannot continue to lead that country. He must be overthrown. Assad is an evil man, they tell us. His latest crime is a chlorine gas attack carried out over the weekend by his forces against a rebel-held suburb of Damascus. Assad's poison gas suffocated children. Pictures of the aftermath of that are all over the internet, and they are horrifying. Assad is a monster. That's the official story. Almost everyone in power claims to believe it. The push to war in Syria, by the way, has united politicians from both sides. Lindsey Graham and Howard Dean typically agree on very little. Not much at all. But today they are both calling for war in Syria. Graham is demanding massive attacks on the Syrian military. Dean is going even further than that. On Twitter, he called the president, quote, a wimp for merely sending thousands of troops and launching tons of bombs at Syria. That's not enough for Howard Dean, who, as you may remember, once ran for president as the peace candidate. Tonight, he wants total war in Syria. Television pundits, of course, strongly agree. This morning, the foreign policy team over on MSNBC explained that it's far more important for American troops to fight in Syria than it is to secure our own border here in America. Watch.
There's no question that now, all these years later, it is Donald Trump's challenge. He has to take action. He's spoken to Macron. What he ought to do is a coordinated action. There has to be a comprehensive response.
As Trump leaves to fight his imaginary border war, he's leaving the real war where we could make a difference, and said he's turning it over to Assad and to Iran and to ISIS. This is something that Barack Obama wouldn't even do if confronted with these set of facts.
Trump has to take action in Syria. Everyone nods sagely. That ought to make you nervous. Universal bipartisan agreement on anything is usually the first sign that something deeply unwise is about to happen, if only because there is nobody left to ask skeptical questions. And we should be skeptical of this, starting with the poison gas attack itself. All the geniuses tell us that Assad killed those children. But do they really know that? Of course they don't really know that. They're making it up. They have no real idea what happened. Actually, both sides in the Syrian civil war possess chemical weapons. How would it benefit Assad using chlorine gas last weekend? Well, it wouldn't. Assad's forces had been winning the war in Syria. The administration just announced its plans to pull American troops out of Syria, having vanquished ISIS. That's good news for Assad, and about the only thing he could do to reverse it and to hurt himself would be to use poison gas against children. Well, he did it anyway, they tell us. He's that evil. Please. Keep in mind, this is the same story they told us last April. Do you remember that? It was almost exactly a year ago. The new administration announced it was no longer seeking to depose Assad from power. Regime change was no longer our policy. So the usual war chorus in Washington started yelping, went berserk, and days later, Assad supposedly used sarin gas against civilians in Syria. There was video. We bombed a Syrian airbase in response to that. At the time, this show asked what seemed like the obvious question: are we really sure that Assad did that? It seems weirdly timed and counterproductive to him. Shut up, they explained. Of course we're sure. What an unpatriotic question. But of course they were lying. 2 months ago, the Secretary of Defense admitted that actually we still have no proof that Assad used sarin gas last year. The story, it turns out, was propaganda. It was designed to manipulate Americans, just like so much of what they say. We've seen this movie before, and we know how it ends. But just for the sake of argument, let's assume they're not lying this time. Let's assume Assad did just use chlorine gas against kids. He's perfectly capable of that, by the way, not defending his moral character. Let's say he did do it. Would that be worth starting a new war over? Overthrowing Assad's regime in Syria would result in chaos. Many thousands would die. In fact, we might likely see the genocide of one of the last remaining Christian communities in the Middle East, and we ought to care about that. Some of the dead, of course, would be American servicemen. A new war would cost us tens of billions of dollars, maybe hundreds of billions. Would it make America safer? Would it make the region more stable? Let's see. How exactly did regime change work in Iraq and Libya? Doesn't matter, say our moral leaders on CNN and everywhere else. Atrocities like this cannot be tolerated. Okay, but let's be real. We do tolerate atrocities like this all the time. For example, there's a devastating famine killing children in Yemen right now. The Saudis are causing that famine. Should we drop tomahawks on Riyadh in response? Not until it's on YouTube, apparently. When you conduct foreign policy by viral video, pictures are essential. But in real life, Syria is a highly complicated place. With Assad gone, who would run it exactly? Do we have another strongman in place to install? Or is it our hope that a stable democracy will magically appear in the wake of this protracted civil war? And who exactly are these moderate rebels you're always hearing about, the ones that we're supporting with your tax dollars? Well, a lot of them turn out to be Islamist crazies. For example, the city where the chemical attack just occurred is mostly controlled by the Army of Islam. It's a radical group that has called for establishing an Islamic state under Sharia law in Syria. That group's founder called for exterminating all Shia Muslims and Alawites from the country. But we're supposed to wage a new war on this group's behalf. Why is that exactly? Back in 2013, when the Syrian civil war was still in its early days, one onlooker weighed in on Twitter. Here's part of what he wrote, quote, "We should stay the hell out of Syria. The rebels are just as bad as the current regime. What will we get for our lives and billions of dollars? Zero." In another tweet, he said this, quote, "Let the Arab League take care of Syria. Why are these rich Arab countries not paying us for the tremendous cost of such an attack?" And in yet another tweet, he said this, "What will we get for bombing Syria beside more debt and a possible long-term conflict?" Of course, you know who wrote that. It was Donald Trump, and he was right. And that's one of the reasons he got elected president. And now the same people who brought you a dying American middle class, undefended American borders, and endless pointless wars in countries you could not find on a map are telling the president he's got to depose Assad for reasons that are both unclear and demonstrably dishonest. And by the way, it may happen. But before it does, Congress ought to consider a brand new constitutional amendment. Let's call it the Lindsey Graham Amendment. And here's what it would say. Congress shall topple no government until it finishes rebuilding the last government it toppled. And furthermore, talk show generals shall be required to personally visit the battlefield of every war they advocate for. End of amendment. That would have an immediate and positive effect. Let's hope it passes. Senator Roger Wicker is a Republican representing the state of Mississippi, and he joins us tonight. Senator, thanks for coming on. What is the American national security interest that would be served by regime change in Syria?
Well, if you care about Israel, you have to be interested at least in what's going on in Syria. We're fighting ISIS there. Iran is seeking to dominate the whole region. I think we have national interests in Syria. But let me say this about what candidate Trump may have said, or what he said before he was a candidate. You know, there is information you receive when you're president of the United States that you really don't have as a candidate. And I appreciate the president putting a team around him that I have confidence in. Secretary Mattis and General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I think are going to give the president good advice. John Bolton's starting today, and I
there are
think,
smart and decent people around him.
They're going to tell him what he needs to hear.
Well, and there's certainly a lot of those people are smart. But I just want to get back to the core question that I think a lot of voters have, which is what's the American national security interest that is served? You said if you care about Israel, I do care about Israel, but what's the American national security interest that would be served by regime change? You can think of a lot of potential downsides, deaths, cost, et cetera. How would this country become safer by overthrowing Assad?
I'm not sure that regime change is still our goal there. It was the goal of Barack Obama. It hasn't really been our stated goal during this Trump administration. But defeating ISIS in Iraq and in Syria is still our goal. And I think that is in the national interest.
But wasn't defeating ISIS one of the goals of the Assad government? Of course, ISIS was a radical Sunni group. Assad is an Alawite allied with the Shiites. He was fighting ISIS as well. So why wouldn't we, if we believe ISIS is the main enemy, functionally find ourselves on the side of Assad?
Well, you're correct in this sense, and you're correct in many ways. It's complicated in Syria. There's no question about it. I mean, there's not a bunch of white hats and a bunch of black hats.
Right.
So I'll give you that. We are, and we're not in the business of regime change, so I would challenge that. But it is within our national interest to make sure ISIS is defeated, and we've almost got the job done. I just think it would be a mistake to pull away at this point. I'm very interested in the questions you're asking about whether this is some sort of a hoax or whether this poison gas attack really didn't happen, was done by someone else.
Well, I'm not suggesting that.
That's a question that Mr. Putin is asking, and he has a right to ask it, and so do you. I find myself on the
I'm
other
not sure
side
I understand
of
the
that issue.
implication. I'm not sure I understand the implication of adding Putin to that equation.
That he's asking. I'm just saying it's a question
that's not relevant.
Slow
down, Senator. That's not relevant to why I asked the question, and I hope you're not trying to impugn my motive by tying me to Putin, as so many on the left do. Let me ask again. We were told a year ago that the sarin gas attack in Syria was committed by regime forces, by Assad's regime. We learned 2 months ago that we don't really know that we were lied to about that. I would think as a U.S. Senator, you would have an interest in getting to the truth, because the truth matters, doesn't it?
I think it's perfectly fine for someone in a position like you to ask that question.
Why aren't you asking the question?
I'm convinced. Well, I've been listening to a lot over the last year, and for my purposes, I'm convinced that Bashar Assad was very much involved in the attack a year ago. The United Nations Security Council is currently, based on information I've heard, I think the United Nations Security Council
can you characterize it for us? Because the Secretary of Defense. I'm sorry, I wouldn't typically interrupt you, but you suggested that I was somehow allied with Putin. So I think I can press you on this question.
I'm
the Secretary
suggesting
of
that
Defense.
you asked the same question that he asked, and that's fair.
So I must be a Russian agent. I get it, right?
I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that.
Because it's a very obvious question, actually, and the Secretary of Defense said 2 months ago that we didn't have proof, but you apparently have proof that the Secretary of Defense doesn't have. Could you characterize it for us?
No. I'm
Why?
not going to get into that further.
Okay. So are you satisfied that we know for a fact that the Assad regime, acting against its own strategic interests, was behind the chlorine gas attack this weekend?
And as I was about to say, Tucker, the UN Security Council is looking at that very issue right now. The President of the United States has concluded that, in fact, Bashar Assad was involved in this and was responsible for it. And I assume he's making that statement based on the best facts he can get from the Secretary of Defense and from the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and his incoming National Security Advisor.
Okay, well, I guess Putin and I would like a little more detail on that before we launch a new war on the basis of it. Do you think that's a fair question to ask?
I think you are asking interesting questions, and they need to be asked. Where I come down is that we have a strategic interest there, and it doesn't make sense for us to leave without getting the job done. I would be results-based in Syria rather than timeline-based.
Okay. Well, that was revealing. Thank you, Senator. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Theo Padnos knows a lot about Syria. He's a journalist who spent 2 years as the hostage of al-Nusra's Syrian Islamist rebel group, and he joins us tonight. Theo, thanks for coming on. So one of the many questions here is who is behind the chemical attack of the weekend, the chlorine gas attack? And I think we all assume it. We saw the pictures, so something happened. So one of the first questions is the Assad regime the only group in the region that possesses these weapons?
Of course not. We have videos, And I have been in conversation with these people. I mean, I lived with them for 2 years. I know what their goals are in life. They are interested in carrying out a war of extermination against their enemies, particularly the Alawites, but really against the Syrian government. And you know, they're more than willing to use any weapon whatsoever, anything it takes to rid themselves of their enemies. I'm quite persuaded that their goal is total annihilation of the enemy, and they think that chemical weapons will do the trick. And they talk to me about, you know, these ambitions of theirs to exterminate the enemy. I have no doubt that this is, you know, something that they desire. It's their dream. They believe that they own this land, that God gave it to them, and that they should kick the other people out, kill them.
So since you spent years as a captive and are familiar with some of these groups, characterize for us, if you will, some of the rebel groups that the United States appears to be supporting and that we hope will take the place of the Assad regime once they're deposed.
I mean, I can give you this characterization. I can tell you that the people that we believe we're supporting, I mean, as soon as we give you know, a nickel to these people, it goes in 10 different directions. They divide every asset that is fungible up among the people that, among themselves. We don't know who we're giving our guns and our money to. We just don't. And even though we clear them, we vet them, and we train them, we don't know what happens once they go into the country. And it's just, it's an unexplored emptiness, those places that the rebels control. The reason why we cannot investigate and figure out who actually committed these chemical attacks is because every time you know, any outside person that goes into these areas is either disappeared or will end up in a cage or tortured or will have his head cut off. So it's really, it's quite impossible to explore the origin of these crimes. It's true that there are a number of possible culprits, but before we go starting any wars, we should investigate properly, and we can't do that now because we cannot access the scene of the crime.
Well, yeah, thank you for reminding us how complex this all is, and you have, of course, firsthand experience with it. Theo Padnos, I appreciate it.
You bet.
You've been hearing it day after day on virtually every show on the other channels. Defending America's own borders is a fake issue. In fact, it's immoral, while intervening in Syria 6,000 miles away is a real one and a moral imperative. Does anybody actually believe that? Why are people saying that exactly? Colonel Doug Macgregor is a retired Army colonel, author of the book Margin of Victory, and he joins us tonight. Colonel, as you see people make simultaneously the case against using force to protect our southern borders, but in favor of using force to protect the territorial integrity of Syria, what do you think?
Well, I think it's lunacy, to be perfectly blunt. It's a crazy idea. First of all, the United States Armed Forces, at least as far as the Constitution is concerned, exist primarily to defend the United States. That includes its borders against foreign penetration. And for 150 years, we've tried to defend those borders. For 100 of those years, we had the United States Army on the border. From 1867 onward, we built forts. We had thousands of troops down there. All the generals that commanded our forces during the Second World War served on the Mexican border. We've been dealing with criminality, corruption, forms of terrorism for decades. And this is not a new problem. People need to understand that Mexico is America's soft underbelly. Before World War II and the Rainbow Plans, we recognized that Mexico presented a threat because Mexico also sides with our enemies. Mexico sided with Germany during World War I against us. Mexico was the principal platform for the KGB in the Western Hemisphere all through the Cold War. Mexico is hostile to us. And for the last 40 or 50 years, anyone heading north in Mexico who said they wanted to go to the United States got to ride on public transportation for nothing. Now add to that the drug trafficking, which is now capitalized on corruption on a scale never before seen in the history of that country, and then the millions and millions and millions of people that had penetrated our border. Then look at the nexus of terrorism and criminality in the Caribbean basin, where we intercept every day thousands of communications in Farsi, in Arabic, in Russian, in Chinese. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that we have real conflict in Mexico, and we ignore it at great peril. We're already spending billions to deal with the consequences of illegal immigration and the criminality here. We have criminals in our jails, costs us hundreds of billions of dollars every year. This has got to stop. Donald Trump said he would control the border. It's time to put the military on the border. The National Guard is nice, but the National Guard is not experienced in this. The regular Army is. We have thousands of people with experience. Yes. We need to put them on the border, and we need to secure it. Then we can rotate the National Guard through.
Thank you for that plain explanation, Colonel. I have a hard-earned, and I appreciate it.
Okay.
We remember that caravan of migrants coming up from Central America. The media said they were dispersed in Mexico, but most migrants in one van say they're coming here anyway. And if they get to California, they'll find a state in civil war over sanctuary cities, and doubtless they'll get to stay. We'll speak to one politician from that state next. Well, the American press declared that the migrant caravan in Mexico was not a problem for the United States, but actual migrants are getting in the way of that storyline. A CNN reporter interviewed a man in a van of migrants in the caravan, and after claiming that many plan to stay in Mexico, the reporter found that almost all of them actually plan to head here to the United States. So if they get here, they'll find a country divided over how to treat them. Newport Beach, California could soon become the latest town in that state to openly defy its sanctuary state law. Joe Alioto Veronese is an attorney running for the DA of San Francisco, and he joins us tonight. Joe, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So I guess the bigger question here is there are 7 countries in Central America, about 47 million people. Why wouldn't all of them come to California? And why don't they have a right to?
Well, this caravan of people, these are asylum seekers, right? This is really a multinational problem. It's a lot like what's happening out in Syria, where many governments have to deal with these people.
It is.
Over the years, as you know, this is something that happens every year. So over the years, we've seen that a majority of the people end up in Mexico and end up staying in Mexico, and this is really the Mexican problem. This is not a problem here in the United States. The sanctuary city thing is an entirely different issue.
But
really that's related to DACA.
Okay, but I just want to, but before you make policy, you have to agree on what's true and who has rights and what are they. And so my question is, every country in Central America, and I've been to 6 out of 7, is less good to live in than the United States. So all the population of Central America could plausibly claim asylum here. Do we have a right to say no? And how many can we say no to? Okay, so if we have that right, then why is no one in statewide office in California invoking that right? Why are they saying we don't actually have a right to keep people out?
No, what they're saying in California is that California is not obligated to enforce federal immigration law. That's always been true. We can agree on that. That's not what these sanctuary city policies are really about. Sanctuary city originally, if you look back at 20, 30 years ago when it first started, was enacted to protect the DACA-type people. And 70% of Americans believe that we need to deal with DACA. Even our president believes that. If the president would do that, it would make it a lot harder for us here in California to defend our sanctuary city policies. There's no question about
let me ask you this. Let's say you had 5 million migrants from Central America show up in California tomorrow, claim asylum, all of them were admitted. Would the state get poorer or richer?
I don't know. That's a good question. I'm sure that would be, it depends on how they would get assimilated into our state. And, you know, once they're in our state, of course, they could go to any state. They could go to your state. They could go to New Mexico, Nevada, and
right,
elsewhere.
but I asked that
I can tell you for San Francisco, it would be difficult because they'd end up living on the street because it's so expensive here.
Yeah, that's true.
You know,
44% of all households in California don't speak English at home. That's the opposite of assimilation. That's a foreign culture living within the larger culture. Is that a problem?
Well, you know, me by way of example, my father was an immigrant. My first language was Italian. I've assimilated pretty well here in the United States, and that's, that's the American dream, right?
But 44% of all households. A lot of these are not people who arrived yesterday, last year, or 10 years ago. They arrived a long time ago, and they're still speaking a foreign language at home. Is this a problem? Or is California not assimilating its immigrants?
That's symbolic of a broken immigration system. There's no question. We've got the sanctuary city policies where we're protecting people from, from certain federal incursions. There's no question about it that we are accepting people here in California. We build bridges, not walls. That being said, the federal government does have a right to enforce federal immigration policy.
Okay, I'm not sure I even understand your answer. Here, let me ask you one last question, which is the outflow from California of middle-class, native-born Californians is overwhelming. It's all over the news in your state. I know you've seen it. California politicians are spending the overwhelming majority of their time talking about how to help people here legally. Do you worry that you're not paying enough attention to your own people, to your own middle class, and they're leaving?
Oh, every day, all day long. We are spending more and more money. Just by way of example, here in California, our city budget used to be $3 billion, not 15 years ago. Now it's $10 billion, and we have people running for mayor that want to add, billion-dollar bonds. There's no question it's getting more expensive. Some of the liberal policies are very expensive. We need to start looking inward instead of outward to make sure that our own are taken care of. There's no question about that.
All right. Well, good for you.
I think that we're at a tipping point on that.
You're the first person from seeking office in California on the left who said that, so thank you. Joe, good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too.
First it was guns, they were going to take them away, but now they're going further. In London, which is a city and kind of a country now, the mayor is going after knives. How long until the left comes for your buck knife? Plus, Bill de Blasio's regime in New York is pretty tough on guns. So guess what one of his top aides was just caught with? Illegal gun? We'll tell you when we come back. Well, a possible war with Syria seems like an important news story. But it's not the important news story of the day, not the most important. CNN revealed their view of that this afternoon when they cut away from Nikki Haley at the UN to this.
We must not overlook Russia and Iran's roles in enabling the Assad regime's murderous destruction. Russia and Iran have military advisors.
We're going to break away from Nikki Haley's testimony before the UN Security Council. We have breaking news just in. The New York Times just reported that the FBI today raided the offices of President Trump's longtime attorney, Michael Cohen.
Well, that raid reportedly is connected to the Stormy Daniels story, which CNN covered wall to wall. And of course, Stormy Daniels is way more important than any war with Syria. That's CNN's position. Is it Mark Stein's position? He joins us tonight, author and columnist. Mark, Mark, this is one of those moments when the priorities become really clear. You cut from the UN, we may go to war, Stormy Daniels news breaking. Did you see that?
Yeah, I saw this new film Chappaquiddick over the weekend, and after Ted Kennedy has his car accident, his dad, Joe Kennedy, calls in all the old Kennedy fixers, and they're thrilled because Chappaquiddick happened at the time that man was about to set foot on the moon.
Yes.
And so they thought, oh, this is great. If man sets foot on the moon for the first time ever, this will bury Ted's car accident and we'll be okay. You can bet that if man set foot on the moon for the first time and they raided Trump's lawyer's office, that Trump's lawyer's office would absolutely crush one giant step for mankind, would bury it. It would be on the foot of page 37, and no one would ever know man had landed on the moon. That's the priorities over at CNN.
Not if you had Stormy Daniels pictures to accompany it. So what did you make? I know.
It's as I said to you last time. I mean, it was a perfectly good sex scandal, and now it's a $130,000 campaign finance infraction that Robert Mueller and the FBI are going to pursue to the ends of the earth if necessary. They don't care how many millions of dollars they spend nailing some guy on a $130,000 campaign finance infraction. I like my sex scandals to be about sex, not about campaign finance.
I totally agree. It's way less appealing when it becomes campaign finance related. All right, so I know you follow news from the UK. The mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, is now, not making this up, vowing a crackdown on knives, cutting implements, following a crime wave there. He said, and I'm quoting, "There's never a reason to carry a knife," in vowing to punish all who do. Meanwhile, in New York, in related news, Bill de Blasio aide Regan Stevens was arrested after she was caught with an illegal handgun in her car. What do these add up to other than, like, the end of Western civilization?
Well, it's interesting to me in Britain because I believe the National Cutlery Association has come out strongly against background checks for people who want to own knives, and you know they're thinking that, you know, people, if you outlaw knives, only outlaws will have knives. And I use the term cutlery seriously because people use what's to hand. I was in a French village 2 summers ago, and a lady and 2 of her daughters were felt to be were in their bathing suits, and the Mohammed next to them went full Allahu Akbar, stabbed them with a fork, the fork he was having breakfast with, and a helicopter had to fly in and helicopter the wounded to a hospital in Grenoble. People use what's to hand. And the reality in London, as Katie Hopkins said on your show a couple of nights ago, is that 85% of last month's stabbings, both perpetrators and victims, are basically the result of modern immigration policies. And that, to tie it, what you were talking about with the general about the border, that's the issue. If you don't have a border, if you don't have a security perimeter at the border, you wind up having to have security perimeters over everything else, including
exactly right.
Cutlery displays in London supermarkets.
When you have a population that can't control itself, you can't have rights, actually, is the problem. So de Blasio's aide gets caught with an illegal handgun. Is this like PETA running a butcher shop? I mean, is there anything more hypocritical than this?
Yeah, because basically this is his advisor on criminal justice matters, and she's in a car that's filled with marijuana smoke with a handgun on which all the identifying marks have been rubbed off. And I think this gets to a point that we come back to time and again, that increasingly we live in a land where the laws don't apply to certain people. You know, he'll pull some strings, she'll skate, and if you're connected, if you're part of a governor's or a mayor's detail, you'll be fine. If you work for someone important, you're fine. And if you're just some guy living in some subdivision, you don't need a gun, you don't need nothing. And it's exactly that division. Right. It's that division.
America's
that is
getting a class
this.
system. No, I know.
Yep.
It's awful.
Latin American
thank you
style.
for that. That's totally
Thanks,
true.
Tucker.
And an economy to match. Ah!
Right.
Wish we had more time. See you in 2 days. Millions of Americans, meanwhile, addicted to opioids. But could the phone in your pocket be as addictive as narcotics? Possible. Talk to a doctor who's been studying that question. He joins us next. Millions of Americans, as you know, are addicted to opioids. Tens of thousands die from ODing on them every year. This is the worst drug crisis in American history by far. But there is another addiction crisis going on that gets no coverage at all. Tens of millions of Americans are hopelessly addicted to their electronic devices, specifically to their smartphones, their online video games, and lots of other things that big tech has gotten rich on. It's a big deal. Dr. David Hill is chair of the American Academy of Pediatrics Council on Communications and Media, and he says that smartphone addiction is a crisis for our society. Dr. Hill joins us tonight. Doctor, thanks for coming on. When you say it's an addiction, in what sense do you mean that? I mean, it's clearly an addiction in that the average person checks a phone 70 times a day, but in a clinical sense, is it addictive?
Yeah, I don't think anybody would say that it's addictive, Tucker. In fact, the DSM-5, the current statistical manual that psychiatrists use, specifically carve out that there is not really a diagnosis called tech addiction. Now, there are a couple of diagnoses that they think are worth investigating, and those are problematic internet use and internet gaming disorder. Those sorts of problems are thought to affect up to maybe 8%. The numbers differ from 4% to about 9 or 10% of American youth. But whether that's an addiction in the same way that opioid is an addiction, you're looking at about 116 Americans killed every day on average by opioids. Nobody would say that cell phones are killing 116 people a day.
Of course not. But are they degrading our society? Are they making it difficult for people to continue linear thoughts, to read books, to concentrate? And I know DSM definitions change over time. Would you say it's a compulsion? It certainly seems to meet that threshold.
You know, anything that gives us instant pleasure is something that we can become dependent on. And at the point that we're ignoring the other needs that we have in our lives to pay attention to these things and get that sort of pleasure, then it becomes a problem. We deal with children, and the biggest problems that we see in children related to smartphone use or screen use, or particularly sleep, obesity. There are some concerns about attention. Nobody has proven that smartphones cause ADHD. That's a popular theory, but the science is not out there to really draw that line. There has been a lot of concern about rising rates of depression and anxiety that are coming along at the same time as rising rates. There's an author, Jean Twenge, who's worked on that, and her argument is that the phones came first, then the psychiatric problems, so maybe the phones caused the psychiatric problems. But I think more conservative researchers would stop at least one step short of that. And you're aware of this distinction between correlation and causality. Most people see a very strong correlation, but I don't know that most experts in the field are quite ready to jump to causality.
I know a lot about the correlation between a lack of research and not really knowing what the truth is. And I don't think there's been a lot of research on this thing, which is ubiquitous in our society and wasn't 10 years ago. I mean, I don't know why we don't know more, I guess, is the question. We're almost out of time, but do you have a thought on that?
Many of my friends and coworkers are working on this issue right now. The research is burgeoning, but it takes a while to do a good study. And the technology is moving fast. And so once you get a study in the bag, the technology has evolved right away from you. But I would strongly support more money dedicated toward research, because this is huge.
Well, it's changed everything, and we haven't paused to think about how. And I hope that we will. Doctor, thank you. Good to see you.
Thank you.
The CEO of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, is testifying in Capitol Hill tomorrow. Fox, of course, will be covering that testimony live tomorrow afternoon. We hope you'll watch. We will be. Well, the Boston Marathon, probably the most famous marathon in the world, says that biological males will now be allowed to compete as women in this year's race. What exactly does that mean? What are the requirements to be considered female? And is this arrangement fair to women? That story is next. Well, the Boston Marathon, which is the most elite running event in the world, just announced that the transgender women in general, but that would be biological males who identify as women, will be allowed to race in the women's part of this year's race. This year, at least 5 transgender runners will be competing in the women's division, despite advantages they may have due to higher testosterone levels, among other potential physical advantages. What are the rules exactly? Nell Daly is a psychotherapist, and she joins us tonight. So Nell, my point really isn't to make a case against transgenderism. I strongly think that biology is real and that we shouldn't ignore it. But that's not really the point I want to make. I want to ask a series of sincere questions about what qualifies you as a biological man to compete as a woman, because there's an actual fairness question here to women. So what does that mean exactly? For the purposes of the Boston Marathon?
So what the Boston Marathon, it seems like to me, has done, and I've been reporting on transgendered athletes for a long time now, and I think what they did was they adopted the policy that was set forth by the U.S. Track and Field Committee, which followed what the the International Olympic Committee also set forth as to what to do with transgendered athletes. So they have, if you identify, let's say you're born a man, but you identify as a woman and you qualify as a woman, then you're able to compete as a woman on the day of the race. But you have to qualify and compete in the gender in which you qualified for, if that makes sense.
It doesn't make sense, because it doesn't answer the basic question, which is, what are the criteria for qualifying as a woman? So why wouldn't, I mean, men have physical advantages that are inborn, that are biological, and so it puts them at sort of a great advantage over the women against whom they're competing. So how do I qualify as a transgender female athlete? Why couldn't any man say, I identify as a woman now, and beat a lot of women unfairly?
Theoretically, they could. So it's not as if the Boston, it's not as if these athletic committees are necessarily asking for a full history of these athletes. If a man decided to compete as a woman and ran all those qualifying races as a woman, then on game day, they're allowed to compete as a woman. Now, the interesting fact
here, what are the criteria? But what are the criteria? Like, how do we determine if someone's a woman for the purposes of competing in the women's event? Like, how do we,
Well, how do you
other than a person's word for it?
Well, what they have
historically,
to do is
you took a blood test.
Well, so here's the issue. What they do is they ask for you to present a government ID. So it's what you identify as, not necessarily what you're born as. And where this issue gets a little bit more complicated, and will get more complicated as time goes on, is that states now are starting to say that people have the choice of being considered non-binary and checking that off on their government IDs. So if you have 1.4 million people now in this country identifying as transgendered, and transgender is an umbrella term for many things that fall under it, and then you start issuing, states start issuing government IDs where people can choose
I get it. So there are no rules. I mean, we're just making it up as we go along, which is fine. I mean, if the purpose is to make people feel good, I get it. I'm not attacking anybody, but if there are actual prizes at stake or jobs or marathons, it might be nice to have some rules. Anyway, we're out of time. Nell, thank you.
Well,
good to see you.
Okay. Good to see you.
Are pandas, in fact, sex-crazed killing machines? A new study says they are, despite appearances, and of course we'll have details on that. Stay tuned.